All right, let's get started. I want to hand it off first to Commissioner Nick Josefowicz, who will kick us off for tonight. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I'm MTC Commissioner Nick Josefowicz, and I'm joined here by MTC Commissioner Eddie Ahn. ABAG member Supervisor Mandelman unfortunately was not able to make it tonight because he is busy in a budget meeting, budgeting for San Francisco. MTC Commissioner Supervisor Ronan was also unfortunately at the last minute unable to make it for similar reasons, but she is represented here by Amy Bynert. So thank you very much for coming. I also wanted to acknowledge Rich Hillis, the San Francisco Planning Director, who is with us this evening. And we'd like to welcome you all to the Plan Bay Area 2050 Digital Public Workshop. Next slide. We're happy you're joining us this evening for a workshop focused on San Francisco and the region. I want to start off by saying that we hope you, your family, and loved ones are safe and healthy during this challenging time. This workshop is one of the 9 county-focused workshops we'll be holding. Given the requirement to physically distance, MTC and ABAG will be holding all of these workshops digitally and by telephone. And while some of the information presented today will be about San Francisco, we welcome anyone to participate. And I can already see that there's a bunch of participants from Santa Clara County. Hi, Roland. Today, we're going to be seeking input on Plan Bay Area's 2050 draft blueprint, a 30-year regional vision that seeks to create a more affordable, connected, diverse, healthy, and vibrant Bay Area for all. The draft blueprint is the first draft of Plan Bay Area 2050, integrating 25 resilient and equitable strategies that aim to make the Bay Area a better place in the areas of transportation, housing, the environment, and the economy. The blueprint is a critical step in the Plan Bay Area 2050 process, and we have engaged the Bay Area public over the past 2 years in order to get input on the strategies we will review today. So again, welcome, and I wanted to also thank you for participating, and I also wanted to thank staff at MTC ABAG who have done an absolutely sort of Herculean amount of work to get us to this place in this blueprint. And there's a lot of work still to do, but I'm given a lot of comfort that we have some of the best regional planning staff and most sophisticated regional planning thinking of any region in the country. So I'm going to hand it over to turn it over to Commissioner Ahn. Eddie.
Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to join you this evening as we present important information about the Bay Area to you, as mentioned by Commissioner Josefowicz, to get your input as well. What we hear tonight will help us refine the draft blueprint, which is slated for approval this fall and will be integrated into the Plan Bay Area 2050 prior to its adoption in mid-2021. Next slide, please. In addition to acknowledging the challenges we are experiencing because of the pandemic, we also wanted to state our support of the Black community and all communities who are affected by violence and injustice that has claimed too many lives here in the Bay Area and around the country. As regional agencies that focus on transportation, housing, the environment, and the economy of the Bay Area, it's our role to increase access to opportunity. So we stand side by side with those working toward a fair and just society. Again, on behalf of MTC and ABAG, I want to thank you for spending a couple of hours with us to provide your input. And with that, I'll turn it over to MTC ABAG Executive Director Teresa McMillan for the next few opening remarks.
If I just may, one more thing, there was someone else I forgot to acknowledge. Tilly Chang, the Executive Director of the San Francisco County Transportation Authority, is also with us tonight. So thank you for joining, Tilly. Hello. Sorry.
Not a problem. And thank you, Commissioner Ahn and Commissioner Josefowicz, and all of you. I am so happy to welcome you to one of 9 county-focused digital workshops, and we have been holding those since mid-August and will be concluding August 10th. So again, in these challenging times, we are trying to reach out and touch as many of you as we can with this important effort. Before we begin the workshop, I'd like to mention MTC's equity platform, which complements and again lifts up MTC's commitment and that of ABAG as well to equity within our agencies and with MTC's regional projects and programs. As Commissioner Ahn just mentioned, equity is front and center of so much of our work, and particularly with Plan Bay Area 2050. For more information on our equity platform, the URL is listed here. Plan Bay Area 2050 draft blueprint is a culmination of 2+ years of work, talking with the public about their vision for the Bay Area and the strategies that will help make that vision a reality. The information we will present today is a manifestation and gathering of all of that input, and we look forward to hearing from you this evening. So without further ado, I would like to introduce MTC ABAG staff member, Leslie Lara Enriquez, who will walk you through the next steps in the workshop this evening. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Therese. Thank you, Commissioners Josefowicz and Ahn, and thank you to Amy, Rich, and Tilly for joining us. I also want to acknowledge Jacob Bitliff, who is here representing Supervisor Mendelman. As Therese mentioned, I'm Leslie Lara Enriquez, and I work in public engagement at MTC and ABAG, and I will serve as your host for today's workshop. I'm very happy to be joining you today to help get your input on the draft blueprint, and I'd like to provide you with an overview of today's workshop. First, MTC and ABAG planning staff members Dave Vaughton and Michael Gurmerod will introduce Plan Bay Area 2050 and its draft blueprint. This will include an introductory video that will help us provide the detail about the blueprint. And next, they will share the findings from the strategies analyzed as part of the draft blueprint and review local impacts. And then we'll pause for clarifying questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You may type your questions there and comments at any time during the workshop. After that, Dave and Michael will walk you through our interactive poll activity, and this is where we're going to use the Poll EV program, and we'll explain how to use the program in the next slide. Our planning staff will then highlight important regional programs before moving into the question and answer period. And finally, we will wrap up by providing information about how you can access additional resources and provide additional input. But before we dig into the presentation, I do want to go over a handful of logistics for today's workshop. I want to note that the workshop is being recorded and the recording will be posted to the Plan Bay Area website. To ensure that all participants can provide input, everyone will be muted during the workshop. And we encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please type your questions or comments at any time during the workshop. Staff will answer questions directly in the Q&A feature or during key points of the workshop. As I mentioned, we will also be using the polling platform, Poll EV. And to participate in the poll activity, you can use your smartphone, computer, or tablet. For an internet-enabled device, please use a web browser and go to pollev.com/MTCABAG302. And when we begin the poll, the questions will populate automatically on your device. If you're joining us by telephone only, you can still participate using the text option on your cell phone. To participate, please text MTCABAG302 to the number 22333. Please note that those of you joining us by phone only will not be able to enter questions and comments through the webinar platform. However, there is an opportunity to submit your comments verbally via phone. After the workshop, you can call our comment line at 415-778-2292 and leave us a message with your comments, which we will enter into the official record. Again, you can participate in the poll by texting your responses to each question. There are additional ways to provide comments during the public comment period, which runs through August 10. As I just mentioned, you can provide verbal comments by calling our comment line at 415-778-2292, or if you have detailed written comments, please send them to info@planbayarea.org. And we will post this information again at the end of the workshop. Last, please note that profanity or culturally insensitive comments will not be tolerated at any time. We look forward to a productive workshop, so let's dive in. We're gonna start off with an icebreaker question so that you can get comfortable with the polling software that we're using. So please go to the PollyV URL on the web browser now, pollyv.com/mtcabag302, or text mtcabag302 to the number 22333. Okay, the question should be on your web browser now. We would like to know, pre-COVID, how did you typically get to work? If you're joining us by text, you can send your response by typing the letter associated with your answer choice. For bus, select A. For subway or train, select B. For personal car, select C. For carpool, select D. For taxi or TNC, like Uber or Lyft, select E. For bike, select F. For walk, select G. For ferry, select H. For other or not applicable, select I. And we'll give you a few seconds to submit your responses. Looks like the most popular so far is bus, followed by bike, so that's exciting. All right, a few more responses coming in. Overall, most folks are we're riding the bus to get to work pre-COVID, followed by personal car and the bike. So hopefully you're familiar now with the PollyV software, and I'm going to turn it over to our planning staff, Dave and Michael, who will guide us through the content of today's workshop. Dave?
Thank you, Leslie. We're excited to be here to talk with you and the public about the Plan Bay Area 2050 draft blueprint this evening. And it's especially great as a San Francisco resident to be hosting today's workshop. We've worked to create a more comprehensive 30-year vision for the region's future, integrating transportation, housing, the economy, and the environment. Today's presentation will first highlight the strategies at the center of the draft blueprint. Second, touch on some of the key regional and county outcomes. And third, seek your input on how to tackle challenges that remain prior to the final blueprint phase. As Commissioner Jesefowicz noted in his opening remarks, the draft blueprint is all about working towards the regional vision of a more affordable, connected, diverse, healthy, and vibrant future, not just for some, but for all Bay Area residents. Building on top of more than 2 years of work to develop the most resilient and equitable strategies to tackle our region's big challenges, the draft blueprint includes 25 bold strategies to make the region better for the next generation. It's important to underscore that the strategies you'll hear about tonight are not near-term actions or legislative proposals. They are ideas for cities and towns, for counties, for the region and the state to consider over the long term to address challenges across the Bay Area and beyond. Of course, we'd be remiss in not acknowledging how profoundly the coronavirus pandemic and the 2020 recession are affecting our lives right now. While we didn't predict the pandemic, we have been planning for uncertainty in recent years. All of the strategies in the draft blueprint have been stress tested against the many unanticipated forces we are experiencing today, and they held up to those stress tests. These types of forces range from higher levels of telecommuting to greater adoption of e-commerce to boom and bust economic cycles, among others. And while this summer is a great time to ensure our strategies are best aligned for a post-COVID future, It's important to note that some of these strategies are incredibly timely for the moment we are in. These include quick-build bicycle improvements for a world where public transit has much lower capacity requirements, renter protections for families at risk of eviction, childcare subsidies and other services for our essential workers, and of course, expanded open space investments for a point in time where we are all too often seeking respite from sheltering in place. Now let's learn more about the full suite of draft blueprint strategies and turn to a brief video describing the draft blueprint. If you have trouble hearing or seeing the video, we'll be posting a link to the video in the chat. And again, please feel free to enter comments or questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we will answer them at set points during the workshop.
Hi, thank you for joining us. As we navigate these unprecedented times, we thank you for taking a moment to think about the future. The Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the Association of Bay Area Governments are creating a plan to make the Bay Area more resilient in the face of unexpected challenges like the one we are experiencing now. How we react to this is key to making the Bay Area more affordable, connected, diverse, healthy, and vibrant for all. Over the next few minutes, we will outline our ideas for the future in a plan we call Plan Bay Area 2050, the regional vision for transportation, housing, the economy, and the environment for the next 3 decades. The heart of the plan, what we are calling the blueprint, is what we'll be focusing on today. Over the last 2 years, we asked people like you for ideas on solutions to meet the Bay Area's transportation and housing challenges and ensure the region's economic resilience and extraordinary natural beauty. We analyzed the most promising recommendations to come up with 25 proposed strategies, which together make up the draft blueprint. We're excited to share these strategies and hear how we can fine-tune them in the months ahead. We're looking to improve our transportation system by considering how we can maintain and optimize existing infrastructure, create healthy and safe streets, and enhance regional and local transit. These include integrating fare payment and trip planning for all Bay Area transit agencies, lowering speed limits and redesigning local streets with community input to promote walking and bicycling, including 7,000 miles of new bike lanes and paths, and advancing transit projects with high ridership, such as a new Trans-Bay rail crossing. We're committed to advancing bold housing strategies that can spur Bay Area housing production, including affordable housing in walkable communities. We can do this by reducing barriers to build housing near transit, transforming aging shopping malls and office parks into neighborhoods, and requiring more affordable housing units be built. To ensure the resilience of our region's economy, we're exploring how we can increase wages and shift the location of jobs by retaining industrial lands that can help us maintain a healthy manufacturing sector, discouraging development of new office parks in areas not well served by transit by imposing a fee on new developments, and expanding the 50% child care subsidy to all low-income households with children under 5, allowing more parents to remain in or enter the workforce. And to protect the natural environment that makes the Bay Area so unique, we are considering how we can reduce risks from hazards and minimize our impact on the environment by adapting to sea level rise in our coastal and bayside communities, expanding our climate program, which implements innovative projects to reduce transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions, and ensuring development is focused within existing city boundaries. Thank you for joining us. Please engage with us on the plan by visiting planbayarea.org or on Facebook and Twitter at MTC Your input will help us create the final blueprint, which will feed into Plan Bay Area 2050. Thank you.
So our apologies for any audio challenges you all might have experienced there. We recognize the video is a little choppy this evening. Luckily, we do have this slide where I'll just give you a quick overview of what you just heard about. I would encourage you to check out the video. It is posted, the web link is posted in the chat after the workshop. So just as a quick summary of what's included in the draft blueprint, there are 25 of these key strategies for transportation, housing, the economy, and the environment, and they cluster into these 9 categories shown here. So as the video was describing, the draft blueprint maintains and operates our existing infrastructure for transportation while redesigning our streets and investing in public transit. The draft blueprint also spurs housing production at all income levels and encourages more affordable housing in all communities. It strives to improve economic mobility through child care subsidies and jobs programs, as well as strategies to shift the location of jobs. And last but not least, the draft blueprint invests in sea level rise protections, home retrofits, and protections for our natural and agricultural lands so they remain free of development. Ultimately, all of the strategies can work together as a package to make our communities more resilient and equitable in the years ahead. And if you'd like to learn more about any one of the strategies, check out our website for this convenient booklet describing them. This is not the first time we've done public engagement for Plan Bay Area 2050. In fact, in fall 2019, the pre-COVID era, we got nearly 13,000 comments from pop-up workshops all over the 9 counties, as well as through an online tool known as the Mayor of Bayville. We were pleased to see the amount of support for taking bold actions to make the Bay Area better for future generations, with 90% of the comments we received at that time supportive of the strategies that were integrated into the draft blueprint. We know that your feedback today will help us further improve the final blueprint, which is slated for release this fall. And it's a great time to focus the strategies to more directly address the needs of the post-COVID era. So let's talk a little bit about the draft blueprint and the challenges and opportunities for the Bay Area. Combined, the 25 strategies make significant progress on some key regional issue areas. Of course, they don't solve all of our region's problems, and that's why we're gathering here for this workshop, so you can give us feedback on how to move the needle even further. Starting with some housing outcomes. One notable outcome of the draft blueprint's housing and transportation strategies is that they would enable us to start reversing the decades-long trend of rising unaffordability in the Bay Area. As of 2015, the average Bay Area household spent 57% of their household income on housing and transportation. But by enabling more housing growth near transit and in communities with well-resourced schools, we're projecting a forecasted reduction by 9 percentage points of 48% of household income by 2050. But even more importantly, this reduction is greater for low-income households, driven by a significant number of permanently affordable new homes we call deed-restricted affordable housing, as well as through income-based discounts for tolls and transit fares. Funding in the draft blueprint enables the construction of over 400,000 permanently affordable homes, which leads to those greater affordability benefits for those who are least able to afford the high housing costs of the Bay Area. Furthermore, a lot of this new growth is focused in walkable communities with frequent nearby public transit service, which enables more people to walk, bike, and take public transit. And by 2050, we can forecast that 43% of Bay Area households will be able to walk to a high-frequency public transit line with service of 15 minutes or better. On the environmental front, there's more good news. The investments in bicycle infrastructure and speed limit reductions discussed in the video could save more than 1,500 lives over the next 30 years. And while this is certainly not enough to get to 0 fatalities by 2050, it is a meaningful step forward to address the deaths on our region's road system. With regards to hazards, things like earthquake and sea level rise, retrofits to homes, as well as seawalls, levees, and other natural infrastructure included in the draft blueprint address 100% of homes at high risk of damage in an earthquake, and 98% of all homes threatened by sea level rise over the next 30 years. Lastly, despite the significant tax increases that are required to pay for many of these strategies, tax increases that I might add primarily affect businesses and high-income individuals, we're seeing that the Bay Area businesses remain positioned for further growth in the decades ahead, even as we face a major recession today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Michael Gurmerod, who will walk through the outcomes of our analysis.
Thanks, Dave. So let's dig into some of the details related to the draft blueprint.
The Bay Area is expected to grow by 2.7 million people and 1.4 million new jobs over the planning time horizon. To ensure that this additional growth does not lead to continued increases in housing costs, it is essential that we produce enough affordable housing to meet this demand, as well as to address the overcrowding and displacement that we see today. For some households, this means market rate construction, and for others, we need to have public subsidies to ensure rent or mortgage is within reach. To do this, the draft blueprint includes 1.5 million new housing units, including over 400,000 permanently protected housing units for the lowest income households. Importantly, the draft blueprint includes 1 new home for every 1 new job. This next slide shows where the growth might occur with the strategies included in the draft blueprint. You can see on the left side that 41% of all new housing growth is forecasted for Santa Clara County, the heart of Silicon Valley. Also, 27% of the growth is being forecasted for the East Bay and 20% for San Francisco and the Peninsula. The North Bay continues to have relatively limited growth. Approximately 14% of all new housing units would be in the North Bay. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see a breakdown of job growth. The trend here, also rather similar, shows a significant proportion, 44% of all new jobs located in Silicon Valley, with continued clustering in the region's largest job center. Job growth is more limited in other parts of the region, but there's also significant growth in Alameda County, San Francisco, and San Mateo County. Important, 70% of the housing growth is in areas within a half mile of frequent transit, and 50% of all new jobs are located in those areas as well. As noted earlier, this is why much of the region's growth is focused in walkable places near public transportation. The draft blueprint also includes a breakdown of where growth might occur on a more localized level, as you can see here for San Francisco. The greatest housing and job growth occurs on the east side of the city. The downtown and SoBa neighborhoods continue to see strong jobs growth, but also significant housing growth. In the southeast neighborhoods, many of which have large developments already planned, also see significant housing and job growth. In total, San Francisco adds 139,000 households and 183,000 new jobs. On this next slide, you can see that we're showing the transportation out into the future. This growth pattern would provide Bay Area residents more choices in terms of transportation. We anticipate 17%, or roughly 1 in 5 Bay Area workers, would change their commuting patterns as a result. On the left side of the slide, we highlight how people got to work in 2015 across the entire 9-county Bay Area. And on the right side, you see the 2050 blueprint shares. In addition to significant growth in telecommuting, we also see more Bay Area residents choosing to walk, bicycle, or take public transit thanks to the investments in bicycle infrastructure, transit infrastructure, and additional density near those transit stations. We know that climate change is creating huge challenges for our region as it's bounded by water on nearly all sides. Plan Bay Area 2050 is the first long-range plan that integrates sea level rise protections to make sure that communities are not flooded. On the left, you see a breakdown of the number of units at risk from sea level rise and also the share of those units that are protected. The good news is that many of the developments planned in San Francisco have already incorporated this climate risk, and continued investment and protection should keep all homes protected with the assumed 2 feet of rise in the plan horizon. Elsewhere in the region, we see most units being protected, with only very low density areas still at risk. The strategy imagines a system of levees, horizontal levees, marshland restoration, and other sorts of adaptations to ensure nearly all of the homes in those communities are protected from flooding. In total, the adaptations in the draft blueprint protect nearly 90,000 homes from flooding, with just 2,000 homes still at risk. On the jobs front, 166,000 are protected, with just 10,000 remaining at risk. The strategies also include 100,000 acres for marsh restoration and adaptation, as well as protections and elevations of all major highway and rail corridors through the level of sea level rise through 2050. So what does this mean for San Francisco in terms of infrastructure improvement? On the transportation front, the blueprint includes investments in the Geary bus rapid transit, the downtown San Francisco congestion pricing, the Caltrain downtown extension, which would bring Caltrain further into the Soma neighborhood, and it includes funding for a new Transbay rail crossing. For sea level rise, it includes much of the work that is already planned, including efforts at major locations of development, as well as San Francisco International Airport. While we make a lot of progress in the draft blueprint advancing equity, improving affordability, and protecting the Bay Area's environment, we're still falling short on one central environmental goal, addressing climate change. Plan Bay Area 2050 is required by state law to include strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 19% per person by the year 2035. From tolling the region's freeways to enabling more growth near BART stations and more, the draft blueprint strategies we've showcased today move the needle quite a bit. We estimate that they could yield up to a 12 percentage point reduction as a result of all the strategies combined. But again, the state target is 19 percentage points. This means that the remaining gap of roughly 7 percentage points will need new or expanded strategies in the final blueprint to close that gap. For now, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Leslie, who will raise any clarifying questions we may have received thus far.
Great, thank you, Michael. Okay, we will now answer any clarifying questions you may have. I'd like to introduce my public engagement colleague, Ursula Vogler, who will manage the question, which will be answered by Dave and Michael. So if you haven't already, please type your questions into the Q&A box and we will work to answer them. For the first Q&A period, we will focus on clarifying questions, so we'll prioritize those. And we will focus on more detailed questions and comments for the Q&A period at the end of the workshop. As a reminder, for those of you joining us by phone only, you will not be able to ask a question as part of this meeting. So please jot your questions down now, and after the workshop, you can call our comment line at 415-778-2292 and leave us a message with your comments, which we will enter into the official record, or you can also send us an email to info@planbayarea.org. So now I will turn it over to my colleague, Ursula.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Yes, we will be answering, as Leslie mentioned, the clarifying questions. Currently, we have 3 questions, so I'm going to start from the top. First question, why does MTC not plan to reach CARB's greenhouse gas emission reduction target of 19%? Achieving the goal will require combinations of public, active, and non-fossil fuel transit.
Great question. The strategies in the draft blueprint include all 3 of the things you're mentioning: a transformative network of active transportation, major investments in our public transit system, and electrification strategies for vehicles. But put simply, the strategies don't go far enough, and additional strategies will be needed to get to the 19% target. So while many of the strategies are bold, the ones that were approved in February 2020 for study, we anticipate bringing forward an additional set of modified or new strategies to close the gap this fall, based on the feedback you all provide this evening.
Great, thank you, Dave. Next question, why does it cost less to drive a car than take transit? How can we de-incentivize car trips?
So that's a great point, and I encourage, that's actually an outcome that's showcased in the outcomes document posted on planbayarea.org. One of the new strategies in play for the draft blueprint was a network of all-lane tolling corridors on our region's freeways, which start to address that imbalance between the costs of driving versus the costs of public transit. There's also a strategy incorporated to provide means-based discounts for transit and to standardize our regional system, so eliminating transfers and making it easier and more seamless to use the transit system. However, again, the strategies simply don't go far enough to address that imbalance between driving versus transit. And so we look forward to your feedback on some of the ideas we have to try to address that challenge later this evening.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Next question. For the assumptions about the increase in telecommuting, reflect the change situation right now with COVID, with structural changes begun during the pandemic. So let me rephrase that. So will the increase in telecommuting from COVID now show up in the document, basically?
We work closely with the state of California, which regulates some of our key assumptions in our long-range planning. One of these, immediately after the pandemic hit, we started work with them to accelerate their assumptions of telecommuting adoption into the future. But we also heard from many members of the public like yourself that would like to see an even greater share of our residents telecommuting. And so we've been exploring some new strategies for the final blueprint that could help incentivize, encourage, or mandate additional levels of telecommuting. I want to just add one more thing, which is it's very easy for us to think about office workers in this region and how more of those could be telecommute type jobs. But roughly half of our workforce are essential workers for whom telecommuting is not and will likely not be able to telecommute in the future. So while we should keep thinking about how telecommuting is important for those sorts of 9-to-5 office workers, we need to be also thinking about our lower income residents, our essential workers for whom telecommuting strategies will not suffice.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dave. The next question is, why did you not mention the San Francisco seawall project?
So we are tracking the SF seawall and kind of the 5 or 6 miles included there. Our plan for Plan Bay Area 2050 is really focused on the areas in the region that are most at risk with just 2 feet of flooding. And so it didn't reach that threshold. It is an important piece of infrastructure protecting a lot of jobs and a lot of housing units at higher levels of sea level rise. And so while it may not be included directly in Plan Bay Area 2050, I think it will be included in future long-range plans.
Great, thank you, Michael. Next question. In the draft blueprint, I didn't see much explicit reference to high-speed rail. How does MTC ABAG see high-speed rail fitting into the strategy? And then as a secondary aspect, Dave, a Trans-Bay crossing was mentioned in the blueprint. Are there preliminary thoughts on which transit agencies will likely operate it?
Well, quickly to the 2 questions, there are some key investments in the draft blueprint. I should say there's some key investments under consideration for the final blueprint that would help to align with high-speed rail service. So not only is the Caltrain system being electrified right now, but there's consideration of further investments like the downtown extension, like further investments in the Caltrain corridor for grade separations and the like, that would benefit high-speed rail when it reaches the Bay Area. With regards to the Trans-Bay crossing, there's a lot more work to do on a project of that scale. It could end up being a BART extension. It could end up being a Caltrain and Capitol corridor connection, or it could end up being both. There's still some key decisions that have to be made with regards to the mode and technology in that corridor.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dave. And thank you, Michael. So I think there's a couple questions. I think we're going to save them until the end. So we'll get back to the presentation now. We're going to switch gears and we're going to do some fun polling. We're going to use the polling software that we used at the start of the meeting. I'm going to turn it back over to Dave and Michael to remind us how to use the software and walk us through the questions. So Dave and Michael.
Thanks, Ursula. All right, it's time for the best part of the meeting where we get to hear from all of you. We're ready to take in your feedback on what we call the 5 big challenges we are trying to address with the final blueprint. To participate in this part of the meeting, you need to go back to pollev.com/MTCABAG302 on your phone or web browser. We're going to go through questions one at a time. So for those of you who are participating by phone only on your cell phones, you're going to need to send a text message to the number 22333. And in the body of your message, you'll type MTC ABAG 302 and press send. If you're texting, the question will not show up on your phone. So we're going to read the question and the answer choices for you each time. So let's get started. All right, challenge number 1 for this evening. affordable housing. We incorporated a whole suite of strategies to make the region more affordable, and in particular to produce more affordable housing for Bay Area residents in the draft blueprint. This included allowing a greater mix of housing types and densities in key growth areas, funding affordable housing protection, preservation, and production, and requiring developers to build more affordable units. And yet, there are still hundreds of thousands of low-income residents without such protections. So our challenge is, how do we create more permanently affordable housing, especially in areas with high-quality schools, amenities, and transportation options? So here's the question. Identify which of these potential strategies should be included in the final blueprint to make the Bay Area even more affordable. And you can select as many as you would like. Press A to invest in constructing more affordable housing units. Press B to accelerate redevelopment of malls and office parks with significant shares of affordable housing. Press C to expand capacity for new housing in communities with well-resourced schools and good access to jobs. Press D to advance innovative approaches to reduce housing construction and financing costs. Or if none of these strategies appeal to you, press E for none of the above. There'll be an opportunity on the next slide to provide your own strategies and ideas. These options presented here are just to get you thinking about some of the potential strategies to address this challenge. To select multiple strategies by text, send the letter choice with your answers as individual text messages through the same text thread. So Michael, what are we seeing in the initial results?
Well, I don't think we've had kind of this level of broad support for kind of all four strategies that are shown there. So it's pretty consistent that folks are seeing kind of opportunity in all four of those strategies. And it looks like there might be a few folks who have chosen none of the above, which we'll probably hear more from in the next section.
Definitely. So we're going to give you a couple more seconds to type in your responses or choose your response for this question. And I think we're ready to move on to the second part of our affordability question. So now it's time for you to provide your own ideas. What other strategies should we take into consideration to address the challenge of affordability, in this case, specifically affordable housing? So input your ideas now. As people type their answers in, we're going to share a few of the thoughts we've received in focus group meetings with historically disadvantaged communities across the region. Members of the community shared that affordable housing challenge to them isn't just about having the units. There's a lot of work to ensure that folks understand how to access affordable housing that's built. If you don't speak English or maybe have a student status, you may not be eligible to apply for the housing that gets built. And there was a lot of interest in programs that help lower income households buy a home or apartment to begin to provide stability and create a known path towards reducing wealth gaps that exist. So I'm going to turn to Michael again. What sort of feedback are we receiving on this question?
Well, it looks like there's a lot of strategies that will get at affordability, both in terms of rental and also ownership. So there's ideas here for shared housing, as well as an idea for land value taxes, which someone has repeal Prop 13 there as well. Also comments on rent controlled, which kind of a version of that is included in the draft blueprint, where we imagine going further than current policies to further protect rental units.
Michael, I want to call out, do you see a comment here about community land trust? That's a strategy that keeps coming up in our workshops across the region, as well as just continued comments about affordable housing near public transit. And it just came in a comment about establishing a housing trust fund for the region.
Yeah. It looks like there's support for continuing to allow for a greater diversity of housing, particularly multifamily and ones that include affordable housing in them. A comment here on broad upzoning, missing middle and all single family housing areas. a comment here to eliminate the unpredictability in housing construction, to destroy windfill profits via competition instead of, instead of paying lawyers. We've also heard a bit of comments about folks making it easier for good projects to get through so that we're not waiting too many years for the housing to show up.
A few more comments coming in here. One person suggesting taxing luxury vehicles and parking to pay for more affordable housing. We certainly have a major funding gap in that regard, so that's an interesting idea. And then also seeing a comment about more prefabricated housing, and that's definitely a strategy that could reduce construction costs, which are a huge barrier to housing construction in this very expensive region we live in. Any last comments here, Michael?
No, but just know that, we're going to collect all these comments and we'll be pulling them all, even if we didn't verbally acknowledge them here right now. So I think we're just going to give a few seconds here.
All right, thanks everybody. We're going to move on to challenge number 2. Before Michael jumps in with information on this challenge, we want to note that if you submit your comment when we move on to the next slide, we will still capture it even as we move on to the next topic. So thank you.
So the next challenge that we're going to focus on and get your feedback on is congestion and crowding. So here's what we've integrated into the draft blueprint for the transportation system. There are strategies to advance high ridership transit projects, others that reform regional transit fare policy, and also included is a per mile tolling on congested freeways with transit alternatives. Despite these strategies and more, traffic congestion and transit overcrowding continue to worsen on many freeway corridors and many transit systems. So the remaining challenge that we'd like your feedback on is how can new or expanded strategies alleviate traffic congestion on suburban highways and reduce overcrowding on bus and rail lines? So just like we did on the last challenge, the first opportunity to provide input is to select as many as you'd like from these multiple choices. So again, the question is, please identify which of these potential strategies should be included in the final blueprint to alleviate traffic congestion and reduce overcrowding on transit in the Bay Area. And again, you can select as many of these as you'd like. For those who are on the phone, you can text A if you want to show support for implementing all lane tolling on high traffic freeways with transit alternatives. You can support investing more in world-class bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure to make it easier to reach local destinations with a car by texting B. To build more express lanes with robust express bus services, text C. To support redesigning public transit systems to provide more seamless transfers and focus service on high frequency routes, text D. To extend regional rail services to new communities and increase the frequency of service, text E. And to widen highways and expand interchanges to yield short-term congestion relief, text F. And if none of those strategy ideas interested you, you can text G for none of the above. So Dave, what do you see here in the trends thus far?
Well, at first we had bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure leading the pack, but it did get surpassed, moving into the number 2 or number 3 position by some of these transit investments. Looks like the highest the popularity here is the redesign of our public transit systems to provide seamless transfers and focus service on high frequency routes. That's a strategy that's particularly cost effective, especially given the cost of implementing new services. Let's work on trying to get our existing system to work better. Also seeing, Michael, the second most popular strategy are those regional rail extensions to new communities and increasing service frequencies on systems like Caltrain. So less interest in the freeway strategies here in San Francisco, although there is some support for express lanes with robust express services.
Great. Looks like it's kind of calmed down, so why don't we go to the next question here. So this is a chance for you to share free response, particularly if some of those others' ideas left room for improvement. So is there anything else we should take into consideration to address the challenge of congestion and transit crowding. And just like Dave did, I think as you all are starting to get your comments coming in, I'll just share some of the comments that we got in our focus groups where, folks were mentioning that it isn't just the big ticket strategies and new systems that will make a difference. It's making sure that the elevators at train stations are working and that individuals have a way to reliably know when a train or the bus or a ferry will arrive. And some very simple investments in making sure crosswalk lines are bold so that drivers know where to stop are things that we've heard in some of our focus groups. Folks also wanted to see transfers between systems, say the ferry and a bus, to be better timed so folks aren't left waiting unnecessarily. So why don't we go and start reading off some of the comments that are coming in.
Well, we're seeing a lot of comments here. Interest in investing in core capacity to relieve crowding before building extensions. There's some major investments in BART core capacity in this plan, as well as, of course, the new Trans-Bay Rail crossing would be kind of the ultimate capacity relief project in that corridor. Also seeing comments, we need to allow more flexibility to work from home, or consider building offices and jobs in outlying communities so people don't have to commute into San Francisco. And that's certainly something that we've heard interest in the East Bay for those types of strategies. What else are you seeing here?
I saw a few comments on making sure that kind of the applications that are telling people when the next bus or train or ferry might arrive, making sure that those are reliable and accurate. There's also, unified fares and scheduling, which I think aligns with some of the comments we heard from those focus groups on trying to ensure people aren't left just missing their connection. Got a comment here on consider bus rapid transit, BRT, before rail. And I think maybe that blends well with the put bus stops further apart. So maybe a few higher frequency bus systems moving through the region.
There's also some comments coming in here about subsidies for e-bikes, free transit. While the draft blueprint includes significant discounts, this commenter is saying we should take that another step forward for our residents in terms of making transit free. Other folks mentioning service reliability, really important, not just travel time, but the service reliability of our different transit systems. And some support for expanding slow streets. I think that really has a strong alignment with some of the bike ped strategies we're looking at kind of neighborhood greenways, as well as, protected bike lanes and trails and the like.
So I think we'll give folks another, 20 seconds here to get your final comments in to this question. This is the second of 5, so we want to make sure we have time for the upcoming ones as well. More e-bikes in my neighborhood, and also folks looking at flattening the morning and evening peaks through flexible working hours. There was some talk earlier in these comments about telecommute being one of the solutions as well.
I want to also highlight another comment here about cost controls for projects. We know that transportation projects have gotten so expensive, not just here in the Bay Area, but in many parts of the US. And so if we're going to deliver some of these big mega projects, it's going to be essential to start thinking about how we can find ways to find efficiencies so we can shave off potentially billions from their costs. A great point. All right, I think we'll move on to challenge number 3. All right, so enough about transportation. It's time to talk about the diverse guiding principle and, importantly, the topic of displacement. Obviously, this is a major challenge for our region in recent decades, and analysis for the draft blueprint indicates it will continue to be a major challenge. So in the draft blueprint to tackle this regional challenge, we incorporated a number of strategies, including further strengthening renter protections beyond state legislation, reducing barriers to housing near transit and in areas of high opportunity, and expanded childcare support for low-income families, so those family members can still keep working even when they have kids and remain in place in their communities. And yet the risk of displacement in most Bay Area communities is projected to continue growing over time. And in San Francisco, this situation is even more acute than the region as a whole. So here's the challenge. How can we further ensure that low-income residents and communities of color are not ultimately displaced to areas with limited access to opportunity? All right, so first we want to get your feedback on some potential strategy ideas. So press A if you think we should expand investment in the preservation of permanently affordable housing in communities facing displacement. Press B to ensure ample affordable housing is built in communities most at risk of displacement. Press C to implement workforce training programs to grow the middle class and make it easier to stay in place. Press D to dedicate and protect ample investments in schools, parks, and transit to improve the quality of life in communities where many of these displaced residents are moving to. If none of these strategies appeal to you, you can press none of the above, or E. Michael, what are we looking at in terms of results?
So it looks like the top two both focused on affordable housing, but maybe two different attempts to get at the challenge. The first looking at preservation, so units that are already built, making sure that action is taken to ensure that they are permanently affordable going into the future. And then also just continuing to build more affordable housing in communities at risk of displacement. It looks like just in me talking, C has jumped right up there with the other two, looking at workforce training programs to grow the middle class. So kind of attacking the problem from kind of the income side. So those three seem to be receiving the broad support, and looks like we might just have one person who isn't satisfied with these four options.
So I look forward to hearing what that person or person's ideas are here on the next slide. So we're going to move ahead and take some of your free response answers to the challenges of displacement in our region. So while we're waiting for your feedback, I want to share some of the things we heard from the focus groups. We heard comments about making sure folks with a poor credit history have a means to rent in their community. We also heard that residents want to make sure there is accessible legal support to make sure renters are aware of their rights. So with that feedback in mind, Michael, you want to share some of the initial comments here?
Yeah, we're just starting to get them in. So first is increase the minimum wage to a living wage. So I think, again, tackling this affordable housing and displacement challenge from the income side. An idea here to build more housing in high resource areas to take pressure off areas facing displacement. So for those not familiar with what a high resource area it is, it's a term that the state and many cities are using to describe communities that have good access to schools and jobs, as well as parks with generally great health outcomes, and making sure that those communities are also seeing a housing growth in the future, and particularly of the affordability kind. A call out here for stronger rent control, which we saw in the first question, and better renter and lease protections. What are you seeing, Dave?
There's interest in analyzing the impact of market rate development on sensitive communities. That's a key issue. Also resolving the jobs housing imbalance. We're going to be talking about that as challenge number 5. So that commenter is ahead of their time there, looking ahead to some of the future challenges. And also seeing some feedback here about, pathways to affordable home ownership for all folks, but especially folks who've been left out of the housing market for far too long. Permanent affordable housing is affordable home ownership, says one of the commenters. And then lastly, one person just texted in, upzone the suburbs and upzone the west side of San Francisco.
Yeah, I think we've heard a lot, not just, here today, but in some of our other workshops thus far on talking about kind of wealth creation and really getting at the home ownership angle of housing, particularly for low income households. So I think that's something that we're going to need to explore further. Proposal here for African American reparations. I know that there's a state law being proposed to explore that at the state level right now. We have eliminate fare boxes and paying on board to avoid germs and touch points with COVID-19. There are a number of strategies that get at reducing transportation costs, but definitely I think at least currently there's this challenge that I think a lot of our operators have addressed in lots of different ways, including foregoing fares at certain points during this pandemic. A call for more protections. I assume that means for, tenants, and a call here for public banks or other ways for equitable loans. So we also did hear that, I think there's a lot of work that can, particularly in some of our small group focus groups, hearing on, it's one thing to have access to kind of the housing that's hitting the market, but then also making sure that people have all the other tools that they need, that they're aware of it, that if they don't speak English as their first language, that some of these services are provided in another language, and making sure that kind of the financing structure is also there to support folks.
Lots of great comments on this challenge this evening. I want to make sure we give people a few more minutes to type in their ideas for the displacement challenges that we face today and in the future. I've first seen a number of folks entering comments about reducing the number of home vacancies, making sure that those are available to folks who really need somewhere to live. I think with that, we'll move on to the fourth challenge.
I was muted there. Okay. So the fourth challenge is one that we've already highlighted on in the presentation leading into this, and it's all focused around reducing greenhouse gas emissions further. We've already included a number of strategies to try and start the ball rolling on this challenge, with strategies that implement per mile tolling on congested freeways with transit alternatives. So that means there'd be tolling on the freeways that also have kind of a BART or Caltrain corridor along them. Building out complete street networks and implementing reduced speed limits. So we've already heard a comment on kind of expanding the slow streets. This strategy, was aimed at doing that with a lot of protected infrastructure, and also ensuring that a greater mix of housing types and densities are near frequent transit. So the new housing units are built are more likely to have access to some of these lower greenhouse gas emitting modes like transit. So despite these strategies already being included in the draft blueprint, we're only a little over halfway to our emissions reduction goal. And so the challenge that we're presenting to you is how can we further reduce transportation related greenhouse gas emissions to reach our critical climate goals? So same as before, you have a multiple choice in front of you. So we're asking you to please identify which of the strategies should be included in the final blueprint to reduce climate emissions in the Bay Area. Again, you can select as many as you'd like. If you're texting in, you can press A to show support for expanding electric vehicle and charging infrastructure subsidies, especially for lower income households. You can text B to show support for postponing highway widening projects until a greater share of vehicles are electric. To show support for charging parking fees to disincentivize driving, putting fees towards bicycle giveaways and free shuttles, text C. If you'd like to show support for requiring employers to implement a mandatory work from home policy 2 or 3 days per week, that would be Strat, or you can text D. And then if none of these strategies are resonating with you, you can type none of the above by texting E. So Dave, what do you see here?
Well, it looks like San Franciscans are most interested in the parking fees strategy. I think that's the first county we've met with that has rated that #1 as the strategy for us to include to tackle climate change. Of course, coming in second here, a strategy that we hear about all over the Bay Area, expanding those electric vehicle subsidies, especially for our lower income residents so they can purchase those clean vehicles. Less interest in some of the other strategies here this evening. And a pretty significant number, 9% of our respondents don't think any of these strategies are the right way to go to tackle the greenhouse gas targets. So I look forward to hearing what those folks have to share as we move on.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and get to the free response. So we're looking for other ways that you think we can address climate emissions in the Bay Area. And I'll just again share what we've heard at some of our community-based organization focus groups across the region. We heard from a number of folks that particularly I think with the COVID-19 pandemic and the shelter-in-place order, making sure that communities have access to parks and green space, which isn't something that everyone in the region has easy access to. Making sure that folks have walking access to parks should be a priority to make sure that those without cars have a place to recreate and get out. There was also, just concern in making sure that as development does happen, that it's an opportunity for amenities like community gardens or reliable and clean energy systems to also be incorporated. So it looks like we've got a lot of ideas coming in, Dave. What do you see?
Well, yeah, you're right. They're coming in quickly. I'm seeing free transit, invest in more travel demand management strategies, expand that bike infrastructure, transit service, and more. Making sure we're not eliminating open space in our cities, especially backyards and setbacks. We definitely heard a lot of support for parks and open space as an essential parts of our urban communities during this process. Furthermore, interested in banning electric vehicles, congestion pricing. That's part of the strategy for downtown San Francisco in the draft blueprint. So that is part of the plan. And eliminating parking minimums kind of aligns with the parking strategy highlighted on the previous slide. What else are you seeing, Michael?
I'm just reading this long one about electric vehicles. I'm hoping I can finish it before we lose it. Electric vehicles take far more emissions to manufacture and are only a savings on emissions if used frequently. Thank you for helping keep it up there for me. Please don't rely on this. This is the last choice. So yeah, I think a lot of folks recognize electric vehicles might help us reach, regulatory targets, and it might provide kind of a way for us to hit 2035 targets, but all of our issues of congestion and safety and so many other things are maybe going to rely on other investments that we need. Put a lot more housing in San Francisco where the AC needs to be much less in other cities. So acknowledging maybe even more so the region as a whole, having a greater share of the housing that supports the jobs in our region so that folks aren't running the AC in the Central Valley and having to make really, really long commutes into the region. What else are you seeing, Dave?
One person suggests reducing speed limits. That actually is a key part of our climate strategies in the draft blueprint. Changing the speed limits on our highways to a more efficient 55 miles per hour. Actually, it makes a sizable dent in terms of getting us towards our climate goals. So appreciate that comment. Also some safety co-benefits there. Other comments coming in, bus lanes on highways like the REX bus network. The commission has been discussing a pilot REX line from Vallejo to SFO Airport as part of the final blueprint, which would really serve as an example or demonstration of the type of express bus, high quality express bus investment that was proposed in that broader REX network. Also seeing some comments about progressive revenue measures to support transit for low-income communities, so important for equity, and a need to make sure autonomous or driverless vehicles are electric. That will be a great strategy for us to consider in the final blueprint as we look to offset some of those emissions impacts from autonomous vehicles.
I think I'll just add on, I'm seeing some strategies on more energy efficient homes and retrofit of existing homes to be energy efficient. In the draft blueprint, we do have a strategy to modernize existing buildings for seismic, wildfire, energy, and water. So we're hearing you there as well. And folks kind of expanding off of that and saying move to all electric new construction. We know a lot of jurisdictions in the Bay Area are really leading the way in that type of action. And we're hearing that quite a bit from some of our elected officials who sit on our board. So we're exploring if there's ways we can do more with buildings. We definitely want to, reduce emissions however we can, but it is worth noting that, that 19% target that we're trying to hit in Plan Bay Area 2050, on the more regulatory side, there are limitations in what we can count towards that. It doesn't limit what we can stick in the plan, but it limits kind of what we get credit for on the regulatory side. Just a little bit of planning nuance there.
I think we'll let a couple more comments come in here on this really important challenge number 4. Lots of different good ideas for us to consider as we, look to move towards this ambitious target and hopefully exceed it in the final blueprint. And I guess, Michael, looks like there's a strategy related to, earthquake unsafe homes and kind of those, rebuild and retrofit approach. I don't know if you want to say anything about that particular strategy in the draft blueprint.
Yeah, no, I think we're actually taking kind of a policy line that San Francisco has led on for really the past 2 decades through their CAPS program, the Community Action Plan for Seismic Safety, where they really laid out a 30-year vision for how they could get from the infrastructure and buildings that they had at the time to a future where all buildings are safe. And they've, step by step, building type by building type, march that forward. And I think a lot of those policies are ones that could really advance a more seismically safe region. We're also very aware of, the other risks in this region. We've spent a lot of effort on sea level rise, and wildfire is obviously another big one that's important to address. And so there's strategies included in the blueprint that get at those challenges as well.
All right, I think we'll move on to the 5th and final challenge for the evening. So the final challenge that we're looking for your input on this evening is related to the region's jobs housing imbalance. Now, of course, in the draft blueprint, there were strategies included to try to make the region more balanced. Our housing strategies in particular were very helpful at bringing housing closer to the region's job centers, especially in Silicon Valley. However, the strategies highlighted here, including assessing impact fees on new developments, retaining key industrial lands, and creating incubator programs in economically challenged areas, proved relatively unsuccessful in shifting jobs closer to housing-rich places in the East Bay or the North Bay. And so jobs continued to cluster in Silicon Valley and in San Francisco, far from many existing residents. The challenge we're tackling tonight is how could more ambitious economic strategies be employed to shift jobs closer to existing housing-rich communities? Okay, it's time to vote. Here's some ideas for potential strategies to address the jobs housing imbalance in the region. We could A, increase fees that discourage development of new office parks in jobs-rich, auto-oriented communities. Press B, to expand business incubator programs to create new small businesses in housing-rich communities. Press C to prohibit new construction of office buildings in communities that have many more jobs than homes. Press D to provide tax subsidies for employers to relocate middle-wage jobs closer to housing. And if none of these strategies sound attractive, or perhaps you don't think there should be as much emphasis placed on shifting jobs closer to housing, you can press E for none of the above. So Michael, what are we seeing?
Like, it's similar to housing here in that there's generally broad support across the 4 strategies that you just walked through, although this is also the highest share of folks that are recommending a none of the above. And so when we get to the next section, we'll be able to dig into what some of those ideas might be. Anything else stand out to you?
It looks like the 2 most popular here appear to be it looks like it's pulling away the tax subsidies for employers to relocate middle-wage jobs, and then to a lesser extent, some of those fees and prohibitions. So interesting feedback there on how we could tackle this challenge. So let's move on to the free response and hear from you what we should do about the region's jobs housing imbalance. While you're typing in your comments, I wanted to highlight some of the feedback we got from our focus groups. One of the things we heard from different focus groups is with regards to making sure that there are job opportunities, not just in tech, but in all different sectors to provide those ladders of opportunity across the Bay Area. Oftentimes, our low-income residents are engaged in very long-distance commutes to access their jobs. Looks like the comments are starting to flow in here on jobs, housing, and balance. I'll turn to Michael.
Yeah, a very direct comment on build homes, build more housing near jobs. A request to use community benefit agreements to build affordable homes and mixed-use development. Folks don't want to see jobs moving away from where maybe they're most efficient, like a transit-rich San Francisco, to maybe a remote office park elsewhere in the region. That could be a challenge, particularly as we're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. What else are you seeing, Dave?
Prop 13 is showing up here a few different times, especially with regards to the non-residential side of Prop 13, whether it could be reformed or repealed. Also, a few comments here related to, eliminating residential building height limits. So some comments, I'm seeing some comments more on the housing side. We have some folks, I think, who are very interested in trying to shift housing to the job centers, maybe a little bit less interest in trying to shift jobs up and spread them more evenly across the region. One commenter says jobs would sooner move to another part of the country than to some housing-rich neighborhoods. We need to focus on building homes near existing jobs. I think that's a really valuable point.
We do have one comment here to build satellite offices, and I think it'll be interesting to see what the trends are absent policy, just in terms of how Bay Area organizations rethink offices after the COVID-19, and whether satellite offices are going to take a bigger share rather than more of like a single office building. That's something that we've heard about before. Some folks are saying it's okay to let some jobs go to other places, even if it's outside of the Bay Area. And folks are saying provide incentives to convert existing and future office space into housing. That's already happening on the peninsula. So we do have a strategy that's focused on maybe some older office parks that either have been vacant for a long time or are maybe underutilized, and converting some of those, as well as some aging shopping centers, into more kind of mixed use, multi-benefit communities where there's both jobs and housing together in the same development.
Let's say one person here just typed in, work with the major tech companies instead of vilifying them. So we have incorporated some of the housing contributions of the tech companies into the draft blueprint, but obviously a lot more money would be needed to offset the housing demands that have been created by the region's robust job growth in recent years. And so that's where it's really important to think about additional housing strategies. And another person is saying flatly, not everyone can live in San Francisco. Perhaps they feel like there's just been too much growth in recent years. So, I'm curious to hear how that commenter would address the housing and jobs imbalance crisis in the region. And then there's a kind of an opposite view being expressed here that San Francisco needs to keep the jobs in the city to rebuild the post-COVID economy. So it's a great observation as well. I think we'll give folks maybe one more minute to submit your remaining feedback on the jobs, housing imbalance in the region. Noticed a few commenters loving some other great American cities. I saw Portland earlier. Now we have someone recommending the jobs maybe go to Detroit. Certainly that would be good for its economic development. On some commentary here about advanced manufacturing jobs, I think the question is, how do we continue to grow those? Incubator programs take some small steps in the right direction there, but certainly not far enough. All right. I think we're ready to move on to our final polling question. So take it away, Michael.
Yeah, so this one will be briefer. All we're asking you here is which of the key challenges we highlighted is the most urgent to be addressed in the final blueprint. And for this question, you're only going to be able to select your top two. So for those that are texting in, If you want to show support for housing and affordability, text A. For congestion and crowding, text B. For displacement, text C. For climate emissions, text D. And to show support and urgency for jobs housing imbalance, text E. So this is looking fairly similar to what we've seen in a few other counties. Dave, what are you seeing?
Yeah, in almost every county we've met with housing affordability, #1 problem in the Bay Area. Even as rents and such level off during the COVID crisis, we all can see how the region's housing crisis remains. And then #2, again, consistent with the rest of the Bay Area, are the effects of climate change and reducing emissions as we are leaving a better environment for the next generation. So in that regard, San Franciscans gave us some pretty consistent feedback this evening.
So this is the last part of the poll EV. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, but with that, it looks like we're slowing down here. So Dave, I think you're gonna provide a few talking points on a few slides related to some other regional efforts that are ongoing.
Thanks, Michael. So we really appreciate all the great feedback you gave us tonight. This is really helpful for as we move into the final blueprint. So I just want to say thanks again for that. But we also know some of you might be interested in not just the next 30 years, which is what Plan Bay Area 2050 is about, but initiatives that are tackling the challenges we talked about tonight, from transportation to housing to sea level rise, in the next 5 to 10 years. So we're going to spotlight a few of those today. So let's start with transportation. Actually, if we could go back one slide, that would be great. One such effort on the transportation front is known as the Transportation Improvement Program, reflecting local, regional, state, and federal funding priorities and decisions. It's a key document that is a 4-year clearinghouse of Bay Area transportation projects and their funding information, focusing on those early years of Plan Bay Area 2050. As the graphic on the next slide shows, MTC is always interested in new project ideas. These often get incorporated in our long-range plan, in this case, Plan Bay Area 2050. And then the Transportation Improvement Program hones in further on the next 4 years of project priorities, which ultimately proceed towards construction and implementation. You'll see a breakdown, next slide. You'll see a breakdown of the 2019 Transportation Improvement Program expenditures and fund sources at the bottom, and we encourage you to check out the project website to learn more. Next slide. Let's turn to housing. One near-term initiative is the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, referred to by its ever-popular acronym, RHNA. Since 1969, the Association of Bay Area Governments under state law works with both state and local governments to identify the amount of housing growth cities, towns, and counties need to plan for over the next 8 years. At the completion of the RHNA process, each local government updates their housing elements and zoning to show how it would accommodate its share of regional housing need. For the upcoming cycle, the Bay Area will need to plan for just over 441,000 new housing units over 8 years, a key piece of the envisioned 1.5 million new homes by 2050. The RHNA process is already well underway, but there are some key milestones you might want to be aware of in the months ahead. This fall, in sync with the final blueprint approval for Plan Bay Area 2050, the allocation methodology for RHNA will be considered by the ABAG board. And this allocation must be consistent with the blueprint you've heard about today. There'll be further steps in 2021 leading to a final allocation and then updates to housing elements by January 2023 in many Bay Area cities and towns. So go to the project website to learn more. Finally, our 2 regional partners, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District and the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, have near-term programs related to air quality, climate change, and climate resilience. The Air District creates the Clean Air Plan with the last iteration approved in 2017. That plan provided a strategy to protect public health as well as the climate, making progress towards state and federal air quality standards while eliminating health risk disparities. The Air District also provides grants for local jurisdictions, businesses, and the public to improve air quality in the region. And you can learn more about their clean vehicle rebates and clean cars for all at baaqmd.gov. BCDC has a new program called Bay Adapt. It's a 6-month effort to develop and adopt a sea level rise strategy to protect from rising sea levels. As we integrated sea level rise into Plan Bay Area 2050, we've been working closely with the Bay Adapt team to understand both the impacts of sea level rise and also the types of strategies needed to protect our shoreline. For more information, go to bcdc.ca.gov. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ursula, who will facilitate our Q&A for the evening. Ursula?
Dave, actually, Ursula, we lost Ursula due to the technical difficulty, so I will help out with the Q&A section now. So if you haven't already, please go ahead and enter your questions and comments into the Q&A box. And we have quite a bit of time, so we can try to get through as many as we possibly can. So we'll start with Theodore's question. How does the insane governance balkanization of Bay Area transit figure into the models with its dramatic statistical variability? And are there ideas for how to address it?
So that's a great question. The region has over 24 transit operators of all shapes and sizes with different fares and different frequencies. It really is a complicated system. I'll note that there's an effort underway called the Blue Ribbon Transit Recovery Task Force that is exploring not only how to address the near-term challenges with COVID and the recession on our region's transit system, but also trying to look at some opportunities to create a more seamless and integrated system post-COVID as well. In the context of Plan Bay Area 2050, we've started in the draft blueprint with really an integrated fare system. So from the perspective of the rider, you wouldn't see the differences between the various systems. When you pay your fares, it would be more about where you're trying to get to and where you're coming from, as opposed to the operator you choose to use. But there's certainly more that can be done in the final blueprint to make the system even more integrated and effective. So that'll be something we'll be looking at in the next few months.
Great, thank you, Dave. You touched on this during your presentation, but if you could just talk about it again. Why not move jobs closer to where people live? Strategies to reduce commuting into San Francisco. This would also reduce stress on transit systems.
So I think this is a great question because it highlights the challenges with regards to the location of jobs. So we often get these comments, why can't the government just move the jobs to some other part of the region? And the reality is the question is, how do you do that? So there are different strategies that we've looked at over the years, from incentives to fees that discourage job growth in certain places, or even caps on the amount of new office development in places. In the draft blueprint, we studied a pretty robust fee structure, and it just simply wasn't big enough to discourage job growth from continuing to cluster. There are a lot of reasons why jobs want to be near other jobs. And so it'll really be up to our policymakers to weigh the trade-offs between more aggressive strategies that might shift some of the jobs, but might also have major drawbacks in terms of spillover of jobs to other regions or other sorts of economic impacts. So I wanted to thank Jeffrey for that question, as it's a really valuable one to talk about.
Thank you, Dave. Question from Carla. How are we addressing the digital and financial divides? Especially, how are we closing equity gaps in free and LMI products? They are hard to get and require uploads.
Great point here. One of the strategies in the draft blueprint is to really have kind of a seamless mobility app that makes it easier for folks who are unbanked to have kind of a digital wallet of money and be able to use that to travel around the region. There's already work underway with the Clipper program continuing to be advanced, continuing to add new equity programs and to move into more of a digital realm. So there's a lot of work going on that front. There are certainly other sorts of challenges in terms of equity gaps that still need to be addressed when you think about some of the challenges with accessing affordable housing, remaining in affordable housing, having access to those services, all these different programs that require means-based tests. So how can we administratively make that easier? It's an important implementation question.
Thank you, Dave. A question from Tarang. What do we mean by innovative approaches in building affordable housing?
I'm going to turn this question to Michael, actually.
Sure, I'll jump in. I think there's a few different ways and other strategies that get at streamlining and changing some of the requirements that are put on new development. But I think the strategy here is really exploring kind of different construction methods. So just recently, I think it was in the news about 2 weeks ago, the city of Berkeley had permitted its first modular housing, which they're expecting to reduce construction costs by something like 30 or 40%. And I know there's a number of other cities that are exploring that. There's obviously a lot that needs to go into to work with building departments to make sure that any innovations aren't, creating challenges for fire or other kind of building code issues. But I think we're very supportive of innovating there, finding ways to deliver housing at a more affordable rate.
Thank you, Michael. And the next question is from Leslie. If project scoring criteria were used for the selection of projects included in the plan, can such be identified and made available for public review and understanding?
Thanks for the question, Leslie. We spent over a year studying the region's biggest transportation projects through a fairly robust project performance assessment, where we not just imagined an envisioned future, but explored a range of different potential outcomes for the region to stress test our biggest projects. So I'd encourage you to go check out that project evaluation and the results for all the major projects in San Francisco. It's available at mtc.ca.gov/horizon.
Excellent, thank you. Another question here, is all lane tolling the same as turnpike tolls?
Well, I'm guessing this commenter may have spent some time on the East Coast like myself, although it wouldn't necessarily involve toll booths every few miles. All lane tolling is an approach where vehicles in all lanes of the freeway would pay a nominal fee per mile to use the freeway. And it can be a really effective way to manage congestion and also reduce climate impacts from our region's roads. The all-lane tolling strategy in the draft blueprint would have a fee ranging between 5 and 15 cents, depending on the occupancy level, time of day, and income level of the owner of the vehicle. So really kind of fine-tuning those tolls to reflect the ability to pay and the level of demand on the system. And what we saw in our analysis is the all-lane tolling was able to really reduce the congestion impacts that we saw on some of our suburban corridors where all-lane tolls were not considered in the draft blueprint. And it played a major role in getting us to that 12% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions.
Are we talking about carbon emissions or not, or climate emissions? I think this is just a brief point from Tarang that I think we're talking about carbon emissions.
Yeah.
Okay, shouldn't the RHNA process start over with consideration of demographic changes that will inevitably come from COVID? It's hard to imagine that growth will be as great as previously anticipated.
Great question. It's a little bit outside of the scope for today's presentation. The RHNA process, the total needs for the region are developed by the state. They were calculated in June of 2020. So they were calculated after COVID-19 hit the region. That process in general relies on population forecasts for the region, which are less volatile than maybe future job forecasts, which were much more affected by COVID-19. So that at this time, the state's number for the region for the RHNA process is now final. So we are working to figure out how to distribute those 441,000 units in an equitable manner that gets to some of these key regional goals.
A related question on RHNA, how is the housing needs determination that assumes current levels of homelessness, overcrowding, and mega commutes continue into the future an acceptable determination? Why don't we lobby for a bigger number?
Well, a few things. Building 441,000 new housing units over the next 8 years would be a significant increase in production compared to past decades. So it would help to begin the process of bringing down housing costs, reducing overcrowding, and the like. It wouldn't solve all of our challenges over the next 8 years, but it would make a meaningful difference moving in the right direction. Ultimately, the ABAG board accepted the state's recommendation for that housing need number. So at this point, that number is now final.
Thank you, Dave. We have a great comment here and a question. I think that there should be more in this plan. For example, what about the 15-minute city where every resident living in a certain density will have essential resources within walking distance? Portland, Oregon and Paris, France have plans related to this. This is important to ensure walkability. This also addresses huge disparities such as food deserts in our urban areas where low-income people have to drive for 25 minutes just to get to the supermarket, and encourages mixed-use developments. While Plan Bay Area acknowledges that everyone should have access to parks, there is also a need for schools, playgrounds, rapid transit, gyms, bike share, and so on. Paris, for example, is figuring out how to repurpose schools into gyms in the evening and car parking into bike lanes and playgrounds. What do you think of this idea?
I think it's a great idea. And I think we have a lot of strategies that maybe we've pulled apart into individual elements, but I think the 15-minute city might be supported by the knitting together of a number of the transportation and housing and environment and economy strategies. And so, we've tried to pull them apart into the pieces so people can respond to elements, but I think, the overall goal is to create many more neighborhoods that function like a 15-minute city. And I think we as planners have really enjoyed a lot of the articles that are coming out and the rapid work that other cities are doing across the globe as we kind of consider how COVID could maybe be an accelerating factor to creating some of these 15-minute cities. Dave, did you want to add on to that at all? Or?
I think you really touched on the right points there, Michael. I'll just add that while San Francisco in some of our neighborhoods really does have a lot of the characteristics of that 15-minute city that you talk about, with often a main street with shops and restaurants and all the like, many Bay Area residents don't have access to that sort of thing. And in the draft blueprint, with the additional density in places like Silicon Valley, there are new communities that really become more urban places with easy access to all those sorts of amenities. And that creates the opportunity for more residents who want that sort of experience, that to be able to live in those communities in the future. So I think that's really maybe one of the bright spots in the draft blueprint, is that there are more of those places being created.
Thank you both. Let's see. Where do our city's houseless people factor into your plan? Even if everything goes as planned, it could take decades to house them. They need help now and more urgently than ever during COVID. So that's a comment from Paul.
I just want to say something to Paul. As a San Franciscan, I totally understand the region's challenges with homelessness and the challenges here in San Francisco. We take that issue very seriously, and I think in our implementation plan, which will focus on near-term actions, we can really have the opportunity to think about some of these acute near-term challenges, things like homelessness in the COVID and post-COVID era. But I would also add, as we think about a longer-term plan, like Plan Bay Area 2050, we have to remember that for every homeless resident, there's oftentimes 10 times as many folks who are on the verge of homelessness. And so by building more of these very low and low income units, we're providing more housing for those folks who are at risk of being evicted and being out on the streets. And so these housing strategies can play a really key role on top of the social services type strategies that are much needed for our unhoused populations.
Thank you, Dave. How are we addressing investment inequality leading to differences in neighborhoods, differences in quality of services, and even differences in loans and insurance costs? What about the large food deserts in low-income communities where there are liquor stores but not supermarkets or thriving
I guess I'll just say to this question, that's a great point, and it's a key challenge in many of our communities of color across the region, the historical legacy of underinvestment. I think we'd be curious what sort of policy ideas you would suggest bringing to bear on that challenge area, especially from this lens of transportation and land use that we're focused on in Glen Bay area. So thanks for the comment.
Thank you, Dave. Another comment with the question. Every time in living memory when there is a crisis, anti-urbanists say this time will be the end of cities. Every time they are proven false, and the fiscal fundamentals will continue to prove them false for the foreseeable future. But that rhetoric reduces public support for policies that will address our challenges. How do we take control of the narrative and use social support as a strategy?
Another great comment here. So, the draft blueprint does still show a lot of growth occurring in the Bay Area region. And so, like you, we see this as having an impact that's, forcing huge changes in the year 2020. And we have done a little bit of work to show the impacts of COVID-19 as well as the recession in the first few years of our forecasting outward. But we then continue to see the region thrive. And so we kind of share that view with you. In terms of how do we take control of the narrative, I think we are trying to make sure that, as real as the challenges are today, that we do try and make sure that we're addressing the challenges that we know will return. Climate change remains an issue. All of you showed kind of a keen interest in continuing to acknowledge housing affordability as an issue. And so we want to continue to advance the strategies that both help us in a time of a pandemic, as well as kind of the strategies that we're going to need to get to a more resilient and equitable 2050.
Thank you, Michael. Next question, how will public accountability and financing work? Will voters have a way to control financing?
Thanks for the comment. I think this question is a little bit more focused on the implementation side of the plan. So it's really important to remember what is a regional plan and what is it not. This is a plan about strategies, it's about policies, it's about ideas. In terms of implementing the plan, that's what we really think about next year and then in the years after the plan adoption. How do we implement the investments in the plan? How do we create programs that, as you say, do have public accountability built into them? All those sorts of specifics are really, really important, but they're often on the implementation side of the process. So just thanks for that comment. As I said, it's a little bit beyond the scope of Plan Bay Area 2050, but it's important to keep in mind.
Thank you, Dave. The next question is around public participation, so I can start it off. How are you going to make sure underrepresented communities are part of the discussion? Public meetings are not very accessible. Are there discussions with communities and advocacy groups? You have not asked about race in polls, interestingly. So I just want to mention that in the spring, we did partner with several community-based organizations throughout the region to talk about these topics, actually. And Dave and Michael shared some of the feedback we heard from those meetings as well. And we also, in addition to these digital workshops, we are providing several other opportunities for folks to participate because we recognize that not everybody in the region, as has been mentioned in several of the questions and comments, don't have access to internet. So we provided a suite of opportunities for participating in this process. And we are committed to, as Therese mentioned in our equity platform, we are committed to engaging with historically marginalized communities and continuing to provide robust opportunities for participation. Anything that Dave or Michael want to add?
No, Leslie, I think you really touched on all the key issues there. We're really committed to that. And not only did we do focus groups most recently on Plan Bay Area 2050, we've done them several more times in the last few years as we worked on the predecessor initiative of this, which was called Horizon, where really all the strategies that you see today came from. And it really helped us make sure we wove equity into almost all of the strategies in the draft blueprint have some equity component to them. We thank you for that comment today.
Great, thank you. Another question, for biking infrastructure, have you looked at what successful biking infrastructure looks like in places like Denmark and the Netherlands?
Well, I love that question because you're making me want to go to Denmark and the Netherlands right now. As those are countries that have invested so much in great, high quality, protected bike infrastructure where it's really safe to ride a bicycle around. And that is really the core of the vision for the biking strategy in the draft blueprint. 7,000 miles across the region, $7 billion of investment, trails, protected bikeways, neighborhood greenways, creating those low stress zones for biking. These investments would not just be in San Francisco, but also connect across the region. And so it's those sorts of high quality bicycle infrastructure investments that are not only transformative from a sustainability perspective, but they're really cost effective compared to some of our other options to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we think it's really a win-win for safety, for the environment, and for health of Bay Area residents. Thanks for that feedback. I do hope the Bay Area has some infrastructure that looks a lot more like those countries in the years ahead.
Thank you, Dave. Me too. I want to read this comment from Jeffrey. 30 years is a fairly long time. It's disappointing to see that displacement of low-income persons will be worse than it already is in 2050, an ongoing trend of especially San Francisco becoming a rich-only city. So thank you, Jeffrey, for that comment.
I just want to address that one head on. That is a key area of concern for us. So when we talked about that displacement challenge, when we look at the data, a lot of what's driving those metrics are challenges in San Francisco, continued unaffordability, not enough affordable housing, even in the draft blueprint with additional monies being brought to bear. So as we go into the final blueprint, we're keeping a keen eye on the region, but especially San Francisco, where this issue is most acute. We want to try to address that challenge head on.
I want to ask this question from Malia, who has not asked a question yet. What about childcare centers near jobs for infants, toddlers, preschool?
I'd like to turn this question to Michael.
Yeah, so I think this gets to that kind of 15-minute city, as well as another strategy that we didn't touch on too much here that was focused on childcare, providing particularly childcare for lower income residents in the region. One of the documents that was shared early on that's labeled the outcomes of the draft blueprint really highlights that one of the strategies would provide basically $10,000 in childcare subsidy for low income households in the region. So I think there's work there in terms of making it accessible to more financially. And then I think, we have heard in other places similar comments on whether it's through employers or making the location of childcare centers maybe more convenient for working parents. So great comment there, and maybe something that we could incorporate more significantly as we explore this 15-minute city idea.
Thank you, Michael. We have about 6 minutes left and 3 questions, so I'll try to get through all of them. But if we don't, please know that we have recorded your comments and questions for the official record. Here's another question. Is removing freeways to make room for housing, office, green space a possibility?
Great suggestion. We did hear early in the Horizon predecessor process some suggestions about different freeways that could be torn down over the years ahead. Ultimately, we're not proposing any freeway removals in the blueprint process. But what we are trying to do is reduce emissions from those freeways, build more housing and office space in our city centers, provide more green space and the like. So obviously San Francisco has a legacy of tearing down freeways. Perhaps there might be more of that in the future, but at this time, we're not considering that as a strategy in the draft blueprint.
Thank you, Dave. Here's another comment and question. Our response to COVID is proving that homelessness and climate change were never treated as a serious crisis. It's even proving that policy based on socialism is widely popular. How can we apply lessons from COVID to our other crises?
Great question. I want to say two things. I want to say one comment and then turn it over to my colleague Michael for a second one. I think the first thing that we should take away from this is how important it is to plan for uncertainty. You know, planners often think that we can predict the future, and we do our best to come up with the best estimates of what might happen. But unless we prepare for all sorts of different circumstances, our strategy responses are going to be brittle in the face of challenges. And so with this process, we've tried to develop more resilient strategies that are prepared for more divergent circumstances like the ones we're living in right now. That's the first lesson. I think the second lesson, the one that I want to turn over to Michael, is the need to prepare for these low frequency but high impact events. And Michael, maybe you can share a couple thoughts on that.
Yeah, so we don't know what the next shock will be to our system. And as Dave mentioned, we've been trying to explore uncertainty and Plan Bay Area and Horizon, the effort beforehand. We've explored things like a future where there is less wealth in the Bay Area, maybe less resources to pay for a lot of the infrastructure that we've built over the years. Futures where there's earthquakes or other large scale disasters, or where climate change actually accelerates. And obviously those futures have some really difficult challenges, but we've explored how different strategies perform across ones that are both rosy or challenging, and really tried to identify ones that are gonna, bend the region towards a more equitable and resilient one. The other thing I just wanted to mention is, it was the 9th slide in the presentation, was just acknowledging that there are a few of the draft blueprint strategies that really could be streamlined or accelerated because of COVID-19 and kind of everything that has happened with shelter in place. I'm just gonna go back to that, and the investments in active transportation, bicycle and pedestrian, slow streets. I think there's a lot of cities that are looking to see how we can use the adjustments that have been made over the past few months, how those can maybe many of them remain in place or be accelerated for adoption over a longer term more quickly. Obviously, more protections for renters. We've seen cities take emergency action, and I think more action for the long term could be accelerated. Subsidies and strategies for essential workers and childcare. We just mentioned a few of those. And then I think, a lot of folks have really acknowledged that this has been a reminder of just how important having access to open space has been for so many in the current condition. And I think there's obviously a lot more that needs to be done there, particularly on the equity side. Not everyone in the region has access to some of the great resources that have been invested in over the past 4 decades. And so making sure that maybe some of the early investments that are made in open space and public space are looked at in communities that don't currently have those types of amenities.
Great, thank you, Michael and Dave. So I'm gonna close it off because we have 1 minute remaining. So I just want to say thank you to everybody for sticking around and providing us with your input. We've captured all the poll results and your questions and comments, and all of the input that we've received will feed into the blueprint and will also be presented to our commission and ABAG executive board members in September. Next slide. I want to let you know a few next steps for the blueprint, and also how you can provide additional comments. Next slide, please. So the next steps for the draft blueprint include continuing public engagement through the public comment period, which ends August 10. The Commission and ABAG board will take action on the final blueprint this fall, and the selection of the preferred environmental alternative will take place by the end of 2020. with the adoption of Plan Bay Area 2050 slated for fall 2021. To get additional information on the plan throughout the process and the draft blueprint, please go to planbayarea.org/blueprint for more information. There you can access background information and reports such as the reports that we highlighted here today. And you can also access the blueprint video at the planbayarea.org/blueprint website. In addition, if you have more input to share, we do want to hear from you. You can send written comments by August 10 via email to info@planbayarea.org. As we've mentioned several times, we have a phone comment line. If you'd like to leave a verbal comment, please call 415-778-2292. And finally, we also have an online form for you to provide written comments on our Plan Bay Area 2050 website. Go to planbayarea.org/blueprint and go to the public comments page. Thank you again for spending your valuable time with us. We know this is a very difficult time for so many of us, so we truly appreciate your participation today and all of your comments. If you'd like to share anything else with us, please email us at info@planbayarea.org. And if you know of someone who would like to participate but could not attend today, please refer them to the website. We will also be hosting a few more virtual events for other Bay Area counties. And as a final reminder, the last day to comment is Monday, August 10. With that, thank you so much for your participation and have a wonderful evening.